What would you do if the most powerful man in the room walked past you? And the only person brave enough to stop him was an 8-year-old girl with tears in her eyes and no one left to turn to. The doors of Vittorio's steakhouse opened with a soft hush, letting in a slice of cool Los Angeles night air that barely disturbed the warm glow of chandeliers hanging over polished marble floors, where every plate cost more than most people made in a day and every voice stayed low enough to match the quiet confidence of wealth. And Daniel Kong stepped inside like he owned not just the room but the silence itself. His tailored black suit sharp against the golden light, his presence heavy. Without effort, the kind of man people didn't question because they instinctively knew better, conversations dimming just slightly as he passed, waiters adjusting their posture, managers glancing twice without knowing why, because power like his didn't announce itself, it simply existed, and yet in that same moment, something small and desperate broke through that invisible wall, a sudden tug at his sleeve that didn't belong in a place like this. Fingers too small, grip too tight, pulling against fabric worth thousands of dollars as if it were nothing more than cloth, and Daniel stopped, not because he was forced to, but because something in that grip refused to be ignored, his gaze lowering slowly until it met a pair of wide, tear-filled eyes. A little girl standing far too still for her age, her breathing uneven, her hands trembling but refusing to let go, as if letting go would mean losing the last chance she had, her voice barely holding together as she spoke words that didn't match the elegance of the room around her. "They're beating my mom." And for a fraction of a second, everything seemed to hesitate, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough for the air to shift, for the quiet to feel heavier than before, for the distance between them to become almost unreal, because in that single moment the gap between power and helplessness stood face to face, a man who could move entire systems with a phone call and a child who had nothing but her voice, her fear, and the courage to grab onto someone who looked like he would never stop for anyone. And Daniel's expression didn't change, not at first, his eyes studying her the way he studied everything unfamiliar, measuring, calculating, as if trying to decide whether this interruption was worth his time, whether this was another problem meant for someone else, another story that didn't belong to him, because in his world people came with motives, with angles, with reasons that always led back to something they wanted, and children were not exempt from that. Not in the city he had learned to survive in, and yet the girl didn't look like she wanted anything, not money, not attention, not sympathy. She looked like she was holding onto the last thread of something breaking apart behind her. Her grip tightening just slightly as if she could feel him pulling away without even moving, and somewhere in the distance, behind the polished doors leading to the staff hallway, a faint disturbance echoed, not loud enough to interrupt the room, but enough to exist, enough to linger, enough for something unseen to press against the edges of what was happening, and Daniel felt it. Not as a sound, but as a disruption. Something out of place in a world that was built to keep things controlled, predictable, clean, and he exhaled slowly, his voice low, controlled, almost indifferent as he finally spoke. "Find security," as if passing the responsibility to someone else, as if this was just another inconvenience in a night. That was supposed to be simple, and for a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it, like the gap between them would close again, like power would keep moving forward and desperation would be left behind. But the girl didn't let go, her fingers pressing harder into his sleeve, her voice breaking just enough to carry something real, something unfiltered, something that didn't belong to lies or manipulation or schemes. "Please, she's bleeding." And this time Daniel's eyes shifted, not to her face but downward, where a single drop of something dark had touched the pale marble floor, small, almost insignificant in a place designed to ignore imperfections, and yet impossible to unsee once. It was there, and in that instant, something inside him hesitated, not enough to change everything, not yet, but enough to crack the surface of a man who had built his life on never stopping for things that didn't concern him, because sometimes the smallest hand was the only thing strong enough to make the most powerful man pause. 5 minutes earlier, before the small hand ever touched Daniel Kang's sleeve, the world behind the kitchen doors told a very different story, one that no guest in the dining room would ever see, because places like Vittorio's were built on the illusion that everything was perfect, controlled, and deserved, and Lena Johnson had learned to move quietly within that illusion, her black uniform pressed, her steps careful across the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of grilled meat and expensive Wine, her shift almost over, her mind already drifting to the late bus she would need to catch across Los Angeles traffic. A ride that would take nearly 40 minutes if the roads were clear, longer if they were not, and every minute mattered when you had a child waiting at home, except tonight, something felt off, not loud, not obvious, just a detail that refused to settle into place. The way the receipt printer paused too long before spitting out a ticket. The way numbers did not align the way they should, because Lena had worked in restaurants long enough to understand patterns, and patterns were not supposed to break without reason. So when she stepped into the small manager's office, she was not looking for trouble. She was looking for confirmation, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the desk as she glanced at the screen, at the rows of transactions that told a story most people would never bother to read. Tips adjusted downward, totals shifted slightly, amounts that would not be noticed by customers who paid hundreds of dollars for dinner without blinking. But that meant everything to the people who relied on those numbers to survive, and her breath slowed as realization settled in, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet understanding that something wrong had been happening for a long time, something that had likely gone unnoticed because no one expected someone like her to notice it, and that was when the door closed behind her. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to signal that the room was no longer hers to leave freely, and Ethan Cole stood there, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. His expression calm in the way people looked when they believed they were in control. His voice smooth, almost patient, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "You should not be in here," he said, not raising his tone, not needing to, because the weight of his position carried more than volume ever could. And Lena straightened slightly, not defensive, not confrontational, just steady, holding on to the truth she had just seen. "The numbers are wrong," she replied, her voice quiet but firm, the kind of voice that did not beg to be heard but refused to disappear. And for a brief second, something flickered across Ethan's face, not fear, not surprise, but recognition, as if a line had just been crossed that could not be undone, and he stepped closer, not threatening, just present, his shadow stretching across the narrow room. "People like you," he began, his words measured, almost conversational, "should focus on doing your job, not questioning things you do not understand." And there it was, not loud, not shouted, but clear enough to carry meaning far beyond the sentence itself, a boundary drawn not by rules but by status, by the unspoken agreement that some people were allowed to see and others were meant to look away. And Lena did not step back, not because she was unafraid, but because she understood what it meant to stay silent, what it cost, and she had already paid enough of that price in her life, her hands resting at her sides, steady, grounded. "That money belongs to the staff," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, and for a moment, the room held its breath, because truth has a way of making even the most controlled spaces feel unstable. And Ethan's smile did not disappear, but it changed, sharpening just slightly, as if the conversation had moved from inconvenience to something else entirely, something that needed to be handled, and, somewhere beyond the door, beyond the hallway, beyond the polished floors and crystal glasses, a little girl waited without knowing that the next few minutes would change everything, because while the guests in the dining room believed they were watching a perfect evening unfold, the truth had already begun to fracture behind the scenes, quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. The air inside the manager's office did not change suddenly, but it shifted just enough to make Lena aware that the conversation had crossed a line that could not be stepped back from, and Ethan Cole no longer sounded like a man explaining policy. He sounded like a man protecting something, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk as if claiming the space without needing to say it, and Lena could feel the weight of that difference, not as fear, but as a quiet pressure that settled into her chest, the kind that reminded her how easily truth could be dismissed when spoken by the wrong person. And yet she did not move, her eyes steady on the screen behind him where the numbers still lingered, silent evidence that did not care who saw them. "You should close that," Ethan said, his tone softer now, almost polite, which made it more unsettling than anger ever could, because politeness in moments like this was not kindness. It was control. And Lena reached forward, not to close the screen, but to point at a line of transactions, her voice calm, measured. "These adjustments, they are not mistakes," she said, and for a brief moment, the room felt smaller, like the walls had drawn closer to contain what was being said. and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that suggested patience was running thin, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the conversation was ending on his terms. "You are here to serve tables," he replied, each word placed carefully. "Not to audit accounts." And the distance between their roles was laid bare in that sentence, not just job titles but value, permission, and expectation, and Lena understood it. She had lived inside that distance for years, in cities where people looked through her instead of at her, in places where her work was necessary, but her voice was not, and still, she did not step back, because something about this moment felt different, heavier, as if walking away would not just mean ignoring a problem, but becoming part of it, and she shook her head slightly, not in defiance, but in certainty. "It is not right," she said, and that was when Ethan's expression changed again, not outwardly, but in a way that shifted the energy of the room, his posture straightening just enough to close the remaining space between them, his voice lowering into something more direct, more final. "What is not right?" he said. "Is you thinking this concerns you?" And the words hung there, not loud, not threatening, but absolute, and for a moment, Lena felt the familiar pull of survival, the instinct to apologize, to step back, to let the moment pass like so many others had before. But then she thought of the other servers, of the hours they worked, of the tips they counted on to cover rent, groceries, school supplies, the quiet sacrifices that never made it into conversations like this, and she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in something deeper than fear. "It concerns everyone who works here," she said, and that was the moment the conversation broke, not into chaos, not into anything loud or visible, but into something colder, something that no longer pretended to be a discussion, and Ethan moved toward the door, opening it with a smooth, controlled motion that seemed almost casual, except for the way his eyes remained fixed on her. "Then you should not be here anymore tonight," he said, stepping aside just enough to indicate she should leave, and Lena hesitated, not because she did not understand what was being asked, but because she knew what it meant, that stepping out of this room would not end the situation. It would carry it into the open, into a space where perception mattered more than truth, where people would see what they were told to see, not what had actually happened. And as she walked past him into the hallway, she felt it, that shift from private tension to public stage, the noise of the kitchen returning, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, everything appearing normal on the surface, while something else moved beneath it, and Ethan followed a step behind, his presence close enough to guide, not physically but unmistakably, steering the moment toward an outcome he had already decided. And Lena realized, too late to change it, that this was no longer about numbers on a screen, it was about control over the story that would be told next, because in places like this, the truth did not win by being correct, it won by being believed. And somewhere beyond the hallway, past the swinging doors that separated staff from guests, a little girl waited, unaware that the version of events she was about to witness would not match the reality that had just unfolded, and that the gap between those two things was about to become the most important part of everything. The hallway lights felt harsher than they had just minutes before, not because they had changed, but because Lena now walked beneath them with the weight of being watched, her steps steady but slower, as if each one carried a decision she had not fully made yet. And behind her, Ethan's presence lingered just enough to guide the direction without needing to touch her, without needing to say anything else, because he already knew how this would unfold. And the swinging doors ahead pushed open, into the dining room where everything was still polished, still controlled, still pretending nothing existed beyond the quiet clink of glasses and the low hum of conversations that never rose above a certain level. And for a brief second, Lena paused at that threshold, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because stepping through meant entering a space where perception mattered more than truth, where a single sentence could rewrite everything that had just happened. And then she stepped forward, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, heads turning just enough to notice, eyes scanning not for details but for disruption. And Ethan followed half a step behind, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest tables without sounding like a scene. "We have a situation," he said, calm, controlled, authoritative, the kind of tone that made people listen without questioning, and Lena felt it, that invisible line being drawn around her, not physically but socially, where she was no longer part of the environment but something separate from it, something to be observed, evaluated, judged. And one of the guests, a man in a tailored jacket who had been halfway through a conversation about investments, leaned slightly to the side, his expression curious in the way people look when they expect entertainment without involvement, And Ethan continued, each word placed carefully. There has been a report of missing property. And the phrase settled into the room like a suggestion more than an accusation, leaving just enough space for imagination to fill in the rest. And Lena stood still, her hands at her sides, her posture upright, not defensive, not pleading, just present. But presence alone was not enough in a space like this, because narratives moved faster than truth, and already she could feel the shift in how people saw her, not as a server, not as someone who had just minutes ago been invisible in the background, but as a possibility, a question, something uncertain that leaned toward suspicion. And near the edge of the dining area, Amara sat at a small table where she had been waiting quietly, her legs barely reaching the floor, her eyes lifting the moment she recognized her mother's silhouette. And what she saw did not match the version of the world she understood, because children do not interpret tones or social cues the way adults do. They see positions, expressions, distance, and something in the way Lena stood, something in the way the room had subtly turned toward her, told Amara that something was wrong, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the kind of way that makes a child's chest tighten without knowing why. And she pushed herself off the chair, her small sneakers touching the floor with a soft sound that no one noticed except her, and she began to walk forward, slowly at first, then faster, weaving between tables that suddenly felt too large, too far apart, as if the space had stretched just to keep her from reaching the center. And Ethan's voice continued behind Lena, now directed toward the room, toward the audience he was shaping. We are handling it internally, he said, offering reassurance that sounded like control, and for a moment it almost worked, the room settling back into its rhythm, the illusion repairing itself, except for one thing that did not follow the script, one small figure moving against the current of expectation. And Lena saw her then, her breath catching just slightly, not enough for others to notice, but enough to break the stillness inside her. Because Amara was not supposed to be part of this moment. She was supposed to be safe at the edge of it, untouched by whatever this had become. And yet there she was, coming closer with each step, her eyes fixed, her expression no longer confused but determined in a way that did not belong to someone her age. And in that instant, Lena understood something she had not allowed herself to think before, that whatever happened next would not just affect her, it would be seen, felt, remembered by the one person she had always tried to protect from exactly this kind of moment. And the distance between them closed, not completely, not yet, but enough for everything to shift again, because sometimes it is not power that changes the direction of a room, it is the one person who refuses to stay where they are told to stand. Amara did not slow down this time, the distance that had once felt too large now collapsing under the urgency in her chest as she moved past tables where conversations had softened into whispers, her small steps echoing louder in her own ears than they did in the room. And Lena saw her coming, saw the determination in her daughter's eyes, the kind that did not belong in a place like this, the kind that came from fear turning into something sharper, something that refused to stay quiet. And Lena's first instinct was to stop her, to shield her, to keep her away from whatever this had become. But the moment had already moved beyond control, beyond careful choices, beyond the quiet strategies she had used her entire life to survive spaces like this. And Amara reached her, not hesitating, not asking permission, her small hand grabbing onto her mother's arm as if grounding herself in something real. "Mom," she said, her voice unsteady but clear, and the word itself seemed to ripple through the room more than anything Ethan had said, because it reframed everything in a way no accusation could. It turned a situation into a relationship, a person into a parent, and for a brief second, the narrative he had been building faltered, just slightly, just enough to expose the space where truth could exist, and Ethan noticed it, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he adjusted his approach, his tone shifting from explanation to authority. "This area is not for guests," he said, directing his words toward Amara now, not harsh, not loud, but firm in a way that suggested boundaries were being enforced. And Amara did not respond to him, not because she did not hear, but because he did not matter in the way her mother did, her focus fixed entirely on Lena, her grip tightening, her eyes searching for reassurance that did not come immediately, because Lena was still standing inside a moment that had not resolved itself, still balancing between speaking and staying silent, still aware of every gaze in the room that had turned into quiet judgment. And then Amara turned, her eyes lifting from her mother to the man standing just a few steps away, the one who had tried to pass by, the one who carried a presence that even she, at her age, could feel without understanding, and she saw him now not as a stranger, but as something else, something she could reach, something that might change what was happening. And without hesitation, she stepped away from Lena and crossed that final distance, her hand reaching out again, this time not for comfort, but for interruption, grabbing onto the sleeve of Daniel Kang's suit with a grip that was stronger than it should have been, her voice breaking through the carefully controlled quiet of the room. "They are not telling the truth," she said, not loud, but direct, and for a moment everything paused, not dramatically, not with shock, but with a subtle shift that made the air feel heavier, because this was no longer just a situation being managed. It was a challenge to the version of events that had already begun to settle into place, and Daniel looked down at her, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged, but something in his gaze lingered longer this time, not dismissive, not immediately disengaging, as if the second interruption carried a different weight than the first, and Amara did not let go, her fingers tightening around the fabric as if she understood, instinctively, that this was the moment, that if she released now, everything would return to what it had been. And behind her, Lena took a small step forward, not to pull her back, not to stop her, but because something inside her had shifted as well, something that recognized that silence was no longer protecting anyone, and Ethan watched it all unfold, his confidence still present but now accompanied by something else, something sharper, as he realized that the story he had been constructing was no longer moving in a straight line, that a variable had entered the room that did not follow the rules he relied on. And for the first time since the door of his office had closed, the outcome was no longer entirely his to control, because sometimes it is not power that disrupts a system, it is truth spoken from a place that cannot be negotiated, cannot be redirected, and cannot be ignored. Daniel Kang did not immediately respond, and that silence, stretched over a few seconds, carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because in a room built on certainty, hesitation from a man like him was something people felt before they understood. His gaze still fixed on the small hand gripping his sleeve, the contrast almost unreal, the fabric of his suit smooth and precise, her fingers small, trembling, imperfect, and yet refusing to release, as if she had already decided that whatever happened next depended on this single moment. And Daniel's instinct, the one that had kept him alive in rooms far more dangerous than this, told him to disengage, to remove himself from variables he did not control, because involvement created obligation, and obligation created risk, and he had built his life carefully to avoid both unless absolutely necessary, and yet something did not align, not logically, not clearly, but enough to disrupt the automatic response he would have had just minutes earlier, because the girl was not pleading in the way he expected. She was not asking for help in a way that suggested manipulation or desperation for gain. She was stating something, holding on to it as if it were the only stable truth in a situation that had already begun to twist around her. And behind her, Lena stood still, not speaking, not correcting, not adding to the claim, and that absence of defense, that refusal to argue or justify, did not match the pattern Daniel knew, because people who were accused, especially in places like this, either broke down or fought back. They did not stand in quiet restraint unless they were holding on to something deeper than the moment itself. And Ethan stepped forward again, sensing the shift, his voice carefully measured. "Sir, this is an internal matter," he said, addressing Daniel directly now, acknowledging his presence without fully recognizing it, trying to guide the situation back into a controlled narrative. "We are handling it appropriately." And the words were chosen well, neutral, professional, designed to close the conversation without confrontation, and for a brief moment it almost worked, because logic supported it, hierarchy supported it, the structure of the room supported it, everything about the environment suggested that this should end here, that Daniel should continue walking, that the situation should resolve without disruption. And yet the girl did not release his sleeve, her grip tightening just enough to be felt, her voice softer now but somehow more certain. "Please just look," she said, not demanding belief, not asking for intervention, just asking for attention. And that difference, that small shift from emotion to request, unsettled something in him that he did not immediately recognize, because it removed the usual barriers he relied on to categorize people. She was not trying to pull him into her problem, she was trying to show him something he had not yet seen. And Daniel's eyes lifted, not to Ethan, not to the room, but toward the direction the girl's body subtly angled toward, the hallway, the space behind the polished doors where the illusion of control did not extend as cleanly, And in that moment, the balance shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that Ethan's confidence tightened at the edges, his posture adjusting, his tone sharpening just slightly. "Sir, there is nothing back there that concerns you," he added, the first sign that he was no longer entirely certain of the outcome, and Daniel heard it. Not just the words, but the intention behind them, the attempt to limit his movement, to define his involvement before it could expand, and something in that attempt triggered a response he could not ignore, because power, real power, did not accept boundaries set by someone else, especially not in a space that claimed to operate on order and respect, and slowly, deliberately, Daniel shifted his arm, not pulling away from the girl's grip, but adjusting just enough to step forward, his voice calm, almost quiet, but carrying through the room with an authority that did not need volume. "Then it should not be a problem if I see it," he said, and the sentence itself was simple, almost reasonable, but the effect was immediate because it did not challenge Ethan directly, it bypassed him entirely, removing his control without acknowledging it, and for the first time since the situation began, the direction of the moment changed, not because someone argued louder, but because someone chose to look instead of turning away. The moment Daniel Kong took his first step forward, the entire room adjusted without anyone being told to do so, conversations fading not out of curiosity but out of instinct, because when a man like him decided to move, people felt it before they understood it, and Amara still held onto his sleeve, walking beside him now, not being dragged, not being led, but moving with him as if she had always known this was the direction things needed to go. Her small steps quick to match his pace, her breathing still uneven but steadier than before, because for the first time since everything began, something was changing in a way she could feel, and behind them, Lena hesitated only for a second before following, her eyes fixed on her daughter, on the way she refused to let go, on the way she had stepped into a moment that Lena had spent her entire life trying to avoid, and Ethan moved as well, but not with the same certainty. His position no longer at the center of the narrative but slightly behind it, his voice returning, tighter now, more controlled. "Sir, there is no need to escalate this," he said, his words careful, chosen, but lacking the quiet confidence they had carried before, because escalation implied loss of control, and he could feel it slipping, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create a crack he could not easily seal, and Daniel did not respond, not because he did not hear, but because he had already decided that this was no longer a conversation, it was a direction, and directions did not require permission, and the doors to the hallway opened again, the polished illusion of the dining room giving way to the narrower, less refined space behind it, where the lighting was brighter but less forgiving, where details were harder to hide, and the shift was immediate, not just in environment but in atmosphere, the quiet luxury replaced by something more real, more exposed, and Daniel slowed slightly, his gaze scanning not for what was obvious but for what was out of place, the way a chair had been moved slightly off alignment, the way a drawer remained half open, the way the air itself seemed unsettled, as if something had happened here that the room had not yet recovered from, and Amara released his sleeve for the first time, not because she was done, but because she needed both hands now, her small fingers pointing toward the manager's office, her voice steady despite everything. "In there?" she said, not looking at him, not waiting for acknowledgement, just indicating the place where her truth existed, and Daniel's eyes followed her gesture, landing on the door that stood slightly ajar, and for a brief moment, nothing moved, not him, not Lena, not even Ethan, because this was the point where possibility turned into proof, where narrative either held or collapsed, and Ethan stepped forward again, placing himself just enough in front of the doorway to suggest a boundary without fully blocking it. His posture composed but his eyes sharper now. "There is nothing relevant inside," he said, and this time the sentence felt different, less like assurance and more like insistence, and Daniel noticed it, not just the words but the urgency beneath them, the subtle shift from guiding to preventing, and something in that shift confirmed what logic alone could not, that whatever was behind that door mattered more than anything that had been said so far, and without raising his voice, without changing his expression, Daniel reached forward and pushed the door open the rest of the way, the movement simple, almost quiet, but final in a way that could not be undone, and the room inside revealed itself, not dramatically, not with obvious evidence, but with details that did not align, the computer screen still active, the transaction log still visible, the faint glow of numbers that told a story only to those who knew how to read them, and Daniel stepped inside, crossing a threshold that marked the end of assumption and the beginning of something else entirely, something that no longer depended on what anyone said, but on what was already there, waiting to be seen. The room did not reveal its secrets all at once, and that was what made it dangerous, because nothing inside it looked dramatic or chaotic, nothing appeared broken or out of control, and yet everything felt slightly misaligned, like a picture that had been adjusted just enough that only someone paying close attention would notice it, and Daniel Kong stood just inside the doorway, his presence filling the small office without effort, his eyes moving slowly across the space, not searching for something obvious, but reading the details the way he had learned to do over years of navigating situations where truth rarely presented itself directly, and the glow of the computer screen drew his attention first, the transaction log still open, numbers lined up in neat columns that looked ordinary to anyone who did not understand their rhythm, but Daniel did, because business, no matter how legal or illegal, always followed patterns, and patterns did not lie unless someone forced them to, and he stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair as he leaned just enough to see the entries more clearly, and behind him, the hallway remained quiet, not empty, but still, as if everyone outside understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by noise, and Amara stood at the threshold, her small figure framed by the doorway, her eyes fixed on Daniel not with hope, not with expectation, but with a kind of steady belief that did not require explanation, while Lena remained just behind her, her hands clasped together now, not out of fear, but as if holding on to something internal, something she had carried for a long time and was no longer trying to hide, and Ethan stepped into the room last, his movements controlled, measured, but lacking the ease they had held earlier, his voice returning, quieter now. "Sir, those records are confidential," he said, the word chosen carefully, an attempt to re-establish boundaries that had already begun to dissolve, and Daniel did not look at him, not yet, because the numbers on the screen had already begun to speak in a language Ethan could not interrupt. Small discrepancies repeating in a way that was too consistent to be accidental. Adjustments that favored one direction only, subtle enough to avoid detection, but precise enough to indicate intention, and Daniel straightened slowly, his gaze shifting from the screen to the desk, where a drawer remained slightly open, not enough to draw attention at first glance, but enough to suggest something had been accessed recently, and he reached forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the same calm certainty he had carried since entering the building, pulling the drawer open just enough to reveal what lay inside, envelopes, receipts, and beneath them, a small stack of folded cash secured with a band, the kind of detail that did not belong in a place that claimed everything was accounted for, and for a brief moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the room had shifted from explanation to evidence, and evidence did not need interpretation to be understood, and Ethan's silence lasted just long enough to reveal that he had no immediate answer that could reshape what was now visible, his posture tightening, his composure holding but strained at the edges, and Daniel finally turned to look at him, his expression unchanged, not angry, not confrontational, but focused in a way that made it clear this was no longer a question. "You said there was nothing relevant?" he said, his voice low, even, and that calm carried more weight than accusation ever could, because it left no room for defense, no space to redirect, and Ethan inhaled slowly, preparing to respond, to reconstruct the narrative one more time, but before he could, something else caught Daniel's attention, something smaller, less obvious, resting near the edge of the desk, partially tucked beneath a folder, a worn envelope, its edges softened with time, and Daniel reached for it without thinking, his fingers brushing against the paper as he pulled it free, and the moment he turned it over, something inside him paused, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to interrupt the steady flow of thought he had maintained until now, because on the front of that envelope, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, was a name he had not seen in years, his own, and for the first time since stepping into this situation, Daniel Kong did not immediately know what came next. Daniel Kong did not open the envelope right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, shifted something deeper than anything that had happened so far, because until this moment, everything had been external, numbers on a screen, cash in a drawer, voices shaping narratives. But this was different, this was personal, and personal things did not belong in rooms like this unless they had been carried there for a reason. His fingers holding the edge of the paper as if measuring its weight, as if confirming it was real, and the name written across the front, his name, not printed, not typed, but written by hand, careful, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that came from someone who took time with what they said even when no one was watching. And behind him the silence deepened, not because people were unsure what was happening, but because they could feel that whatever this was, it mattered in a way that extended beyond the situation they thought they understood. And Ethan watched, his posture still composed but his attention sharper now, because this was not part of the outcome he had anticipated, not part of the controlled sequence he had been guiding, and for the first time, there was something in the room he did not recognize, and Daniel finally opened the envelope, not abruptly, not with urgency, but slowly, as if each movement needed to be deliberate, the paper inside unfolding with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and his eyes moved across the contents, not scanning, not rushing, but reading, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly enough for others to define, but enough that it changed the energy around him, because recognition, when it happens in silence, carries a weight that does not need explanation, and the room seemed to narrow, focusing on that single moment where the past had quietly entered the present without asking permission. And Lena saw it, not the details, not the words, but the change, the way his posture adjusted just slightly, the way his gaze no longer held the same distance it had before, and something inside her tightened, not in fear, but in awareness, because she had not expected this, not here, not like this, and Amara looked between them, her understanding incomplete but her instinct sharp, sensing that something had shifted even if she could not yet name it. And Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lifting from it to Lena, and for a brief moment, they held each other's gaze, not as strangers, not as employer and staff, but as two people connected by something neither had spoken yet. And the room did not move, no one interrupted, because whatever passed between them did not belong to anyone else, and Daniel's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, not weaker, but more focused. "Where did you get this?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, but searching for confirmation, and Lena did not look away, not because she was unafraid, but because she understood that whatever this was, it had already been revealed, whether she spoke or not, and she took a small breath, steadying herself not for defense, but for truth. "You left it?" she said, her voice calm, her words simple, and that simplicity carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it implied a time, a place, a moment that had existed long before this room, long before this confrontation, and Daniel's grip on the paper tightened just slightly, not enough to be noticed by most, but enough to confirm what he was already beginning to understand, that this was not a coincidence, not an unrelated detail, but a thread connecting something he had left behind to something standing in front of him now. And Ethan shifted his weight, the first visible sign of uncertainty breaking through his composure, because the situation had moved beyond his control entirely, no longer defined by policy or perception, but by something deeper, something that could not be rewritten or redirected. And Daniel looked back at the paper once more, the lines of handwriting no longer just words but memory, fragments of a moment he had not revisited in years, now returning with a clarity he had not expected. And when he spoke again, it was not to the room, not to Ethan, but to Lena, his voice low, steady, carrying a question that held more than curiosity. 10 years ago, he said, not finishing the sentence, not needing to, because sometimes the past does not need to be explained, it only needs to be recognized, and in that recognition, everything that had been misunderstood began to shift, quietly, inevitably, toward something no one in that room had anticipated.